Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Okay, well, welcome back to the Gay Buddhist Fellowship, Sunday, July 17th, 2022. Our tradition is to go around and say our names. First, is anybody joining us for the first time or back after a long absence?
I'm after a long absence for maybe 10 or 11 years.
Yes. What's your name?
Gary.
Hi, Gary. Welcome back. Okay, my name is Cass.
I'm Jeff.
Christian. Greg.
Jack.
Matthew.
Kevin. I'm Brad.
George. Stephen.
I'm Ed.
Tony.
Charles. My name is Mark.
Thank you. Is anybody on Zoom joining us for the first time or after a long absence? Please identify yourself. Okay. All familiar faces. We're thrilled to have Anne Gleig back this week. Anne is an associate professor of religion and cultural studies at the University of Central Florida. She is the author of American Dharma, Buddhism Beyond Modernity, published by Yale University Press in 2019. She is currently working on a collaborative book with Amy Langenberg on sexual misconduct and abuse in contemporary Buddhism, which is under advanced contract with Yale University Press. Anne's focus today will be on the shifting landscape of Buddhism in America. Welcome back, Anne.
Oh, thank you, Cass. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you all again. I was a little bit worried I might have scared you all off, so I feel a relief that it's still quite a healthy audience. So this week's class is, picking up from what we did last week. So just as a brief review, last week I crammed 200 years of Buddhist history into a 40-minute speed lecture. And essentially what I'd wanted to do was just to give you a sense of, what are the kind of historical practices that have kind of brought us all together in this kind of moment to do the practices that we do. You're a gay male Buddhist group, quite a distinct audience, quite a distinct Sangha. And, as I said, you are very kind of grounded in the practice of meditation. So hopefully last week's class kind of just give you a sense of those kind of historical, cultural and religious kind of, causes and conditions that brought us all to this kind of moment. So today I kind of wanted to look at a more kind of immediate history, really, essentially what's happened in the last 20 years, 20, 30 years in convert American Buddhism. So today I'm just going to look at some of the current trends and kind of think about, what can we make of those trends? There's a lot of things going on. Can we bring a bit of order? And can we kind of map the landscape? And hopefully, you had a chance to read my article, which essentially is, I'm going to give a very kind of, short version of the article. And then the article itself is a short version of my book, American Dharma. And so if you do, if you are interested in this material and you want a bit more depth, you can buy my book. I only get I think it's $1 per copy. So I don't feel too bad to be kind of promoting myself. Okay. So let's see, we kind of started in Asia. We looked at the Reformation of modern, that resulted in modern Buddhism. And then I think I took us to the meditation-based convert lineages, gave a couple of examples of two big ones from the Insight community and the Zen community. And then we kind of landed on these common characteristics of these convert-based groups. So your group would be, considered one of these groups. Now, essentially, the scholarship that produced these characteristics, where we get this information from, it's probably about 5 books that came out, about 22 years ago. And so essentially, this was a picture we had of convert Buddhism, at the turn of the millennium. And I was kind of, just where I kind of come into the picture was essentially, as a practitioner scholar, I was engaging with this material on a academic level, but I was also, in communities, and I was kind of getting a more on the ground sense of what was happening. And I was kind of feeling like, there's a kind of a bit of a gap here. Like this picture's actually getting a bit more complicated. So I'm going to move into those complications, and I'll talk a little bit about, the journey of moving into those complications. So this is essentially current trends and developments. So I would say that, I would say that the first big, illuminated light bulb that went off in my head was really due to my experience at the East Bay Meditation Center. Now, I know some of you attended my lecture on queer Buddhists, and in that lecture, I kind of presented, the data that I'd kind of discovered at the Alphabet Sangha, the queer Sangha at the East Bay Meditation Center. So you probably hopefully remember some of my story. I was attending the East Bay Meditation Center first as a queer practitioner who was, super excited to be around, other queers, and but then started to think, wow, this is actually something different that the scholarship doesn't really account for. So I did a kind of ethnographic study, and I wrote 2 articles. One was the queer Sangha one we did, but I also wrote one which was more connected closely to what does this mean in terms of Buddhist history. And I essentially say, look, some of the things that we're seeing at East Bay, we can make sense of using this, Buddhist modernist scholarship. But some of the stuff is new, and we need to kind of articulate it in a new way. And especially what really struck me was, this emphasis on cultural, racial particularity. So, and all, really being attuned to the social location of the practitioner. And this is a kind of contrast to the Buddhist modernism. Buddhist modernism, which is really shaped by science, it's a kind of universal narrative. It's like a one size fits all. And that one size, in the United States context became really like the white middle class, size fits everyone. And really, to a large degree, the straight white middle class fits everyone. So if you just think of that as like a garment, as all, I assume that at least we're all queers. And so we're probably like, oh, this shirt doesn't fit properly. So it's like, let's kind of attune the practices more to the social location. So that's something quite distinct that you do not find in Buddhist modernism. Now, shortly after the East Bay work that I did, I just actually ended up, it was really kind of on a whim in a way. I had a little bit of research funding I wanted to spend, and I saw this Buddhist Geeks conference. And I think this was the first one I attended was in 2012. So it's like a decade ago. So I went to Buddhist Geeks conference. I was quite naive. I don't have a great background in technology. But I was curious as like, what's going on here? And essentially, even though the Buddhist Geeks is quite a different demographic to the East Bay Meditation Society, It's essentially, it's super white, majority white, but it's millennials. So you've got, it was heavily millennial kind of driven. So you had a generational difference there between the kind of boomer first gen and the younger millennials. And it was also, as you can tell from the picture, all about like, let's bring Buddhism into dialogue with like social media and tech culture rather than, you know, the more kind of counterculture hippie vibe that really shapes those first generation. So essentially, you know, I found that just as with the East Bay Meditation Center, there were some characteristics in Buddhist modernism that extended, in Buddhist geeks that extended the Buddhist modernist lineage, like they're super into science. But there were also qualities that kind of disrupted and were different. So essentially I wrote these two articles. I wrote 3 articles about these 2 different like sanghas. And then I was like, wow, like things are changing in convert lineages and we need some new scholarship on it. So I just decided I'm the girl for the job. And I wanted to do it as a book project. So this is basically, you know, again, just to like flog my book a little bit. Look at that gorgeous cover. Don't you want one? I basically explore what I've, you know, kind of started talking about in much more depth in this book. And essentially the book is divided into, there's a couple of chapters on the history of Buddhist modernism, like what we did last week. And then there's all of these new ethnographic case studies. And essentially I just, you know, when you organize things, it's always like slightly subjective, you know, it's not like these actually exist in nature. It's like my way of organizing a massive, you know, activity. But essentially I organize them into 3 examples of clear modernist characteristics. And, you know, for example, the secular mindfulness movement really shows this scientific ethos of Buddhist modernism. And then I looked at 3 kind of new kind of emergent trends. And they were the racial justice work, the impact of technology, social media, and then also the Gen X, the rise of the Gen Xers. So in, I think it was I think it might have been 2010. I think it was 2010. There was a conference called the Maha Teachers Conference at Garrison in New York. And at this conference, there was a history, I think it was the 3rd in a row. It was basically mostly convert teachers who were getting together with a few big Asian figures, like the Dalai Lama came to one. He wasn't at Garrison, but he'd come to an earlier one. And during this time, the Gen X teachers kind of presented themselves as a distinct group within their convert lineages. And they essentially said to the boomer teachers, look, you know, we love you, we're grateful for all you've given us, but we want to kind of go our own way, you know, and this is what we really, you know, this is what we really care about. So I did, you know, a very intensive interview process. I think I interviewed 33 of those Gen X teachers. And then I kind of draw out like what's distinct about the way they want to teach Buddhism from the way they see the boomer teachers teaching Buddhism. So essentially, I'm just looking across this very rich, layered, you know, varied landscape and trying to like highlight both continuation with modernism, because continuation is definitely there. It's not like a dramatic break, but also difference. And what is the significance of that difference? Like, it's kind of in a dialogue. It's kind of in a dialogue with what's come before. Sometimes that dialogue is kind of polite, and sometimes it's like you really, you know, you've really made some big mistakes here, white boomers. You know, so there's a different affect tones in that dialogue. But I just really try and bring some clarity, you know, to it. So obviously I haven't got time today to get into all the case studies. But I thought it might just be helpful to give an example of, you know, each side of these, just to kind of hopefully flesh out what I've already said. So in the first one here, I really wanted to think about how is that scientific language and values that we really see, emerging in Buddhist modernism in Asia. Like Buddhism is rational, it's scientific, the Buddha was an empiricist. Like I was like, where's that gone? Where's that lineage gone? And so essentially where it's gone in a few different places. But one place it really went is, it developed into the secular mindfulness movement. So you might remember last week, we kind of looked at the birth of insight. We looked at Ledi Sayadaw, who had started the popularization of Vipassana practice that historically had really only been, practiced by an elite cadre of monks. It was more popular at the very early days of Buddhism, but as Buddhism developed, it became kind of quite a rarefied practice. And essentially, Ledi Sayadaw was like, look, the Brits have come, we can't rely on our king to protect the Dharma, so we're going to have to protect it ourselves. So one way we can protect it is we can spread it. Right, we can kind of start democratizing it. And then we looked at how, like, the founders of the Insight community, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, Sharon Salzberg, had practiced with those, those modernist lineages. And then they came back and were like, hey, we can actually modernize, we can democratize this even more. We can, like, really pare down the Buddhist elements. Now, essentially what happens in the secular mindfulness is, that train keeps on going. So then it goes from like the insight, which is, it's kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A minimalist in terms of Buddhist ritual and signifiers like statues, but it still is Buddhist. You still chant, in Pali on a retreat, there's a Buddha. But when we get to the secular mindfulness movement, all of the Buddhism drops away. So this is, the standard example, which we always use in the academy. It's a Time magazine cover. And essentially, when we teach this to our students, we always say, what do you know? We teach them about Buddhism and then we say, well, what do you notice about this cover in relationship to Buddhism? And normally the first thing they say is, well, there is no Buddhism, like there's not even a word of Buddhism. It's being completely replaced by science. Another thing that, says the science of focusing. Another thing that they often notice is it's really about capitalism, right? It's like productivity in this stressed out world. So they normally say, well, it's moved from like the monastery and even the retreat center to like the workplace. They often comment on the gender. That it's not like, because, I show them the pictures of the Buddhist monastics that, start the practice in modernity. And they say, oh, well, it's a woman. Normally the last thing they say when it's a majority white Sangha, as you can probably guess, is it's a white woman, right? So now this kind of, it's also a blonde. I'm actually married to a blonde white woman and she's always like moaning at me because I'm always giving it, poking the white blondes. So essentially, this is a big shift to what's happened, with Buddhism. And a lot of people loved this, right? There was a lot of Buddhists who really were behind secular mindfulness. The Insight community is one. Thich Nhat Hanh is another big player. Of course, Jon Kabat-Zinn. Like, they are Buddhists who made the secular mindfulness movement happen. They were driving that engine. So they see this as a kind of positive thing, right? They see it as a, essentially kind of like a form of skillful means, that it's bringing the benefits of the Dharma, to a wide range of people who otherwise wouldn't get it. So there's a kind of positive response, but there's also a big backlash to this from Buddhists. And there's different strands to the backlash. But I'd say two main strands are, well, actually, let's say three main strands. So one main critique is that the secular mindfulness is like super mindfulness light, that it's so distinct from traditional mindfulness, and that they will look at mindfulness in the Satipatthana Sutta. They'll really compare the canonical traditional mindfulness description with like secular mindfulness and say this is kind of ridiculous, essentially. They don't really use the word ridiculous, but that's more or less what they're saying, like so much is lost here. So that's one critique, a traditional canonical critique. Another critique is the whiteness. So rightly so, many Asian Americans or commentators, really noted that I think there were several magazines, essentially not just Time. I think it was the third example of Buddhist practices being represented in the mainstream by a white blonde. And that's kind of ridiculous also because 2/3 of Buddhists in the US are Asian American. So a lot of people rightfully critique the whitening of mindfulness. And, that brings in questions of colonialism, like, is this a continuation of colonial kind of thought and domination, but happening now in the US context? The third critique is similar. It's a kind of social justice critique, and that's really focusing on the adoption of mindfulness in Silicon Valley and capitalism. And it's essentially a kind of Marxist critique where essentially it says, look, mindfulness is being adopted to help people be better, i.e. more productive workers. And rather than say, hey, we want to look after our workers, and what we'll do is we'll give you a shorter work day, or we'll give you, a shorter working week. It's like, we'll give you a free mindfulness class. And so you basically have this really like anti-capitalist critique. So essentially what I do in the book chapter is I unpack the mindfulness debates, and I use this like, kind of, I think, fun title that, there's this, first is this tremendous like enthusiasm and excitement about the mindfulness revolution. And then pretty soon everything goes to shit and everyone's like arguing about it. It's good. No, it's not good. This is why it's not good. So it really becomes quite a fractured response. And I just kind of clarify the different responses. I'm just organizing things. And then I think back. So I do that on a kind of descriptive level. But then I think back to the question that I started with. Does this reflect, is this the same as Buddhist modernism? Like, is this a straight line from those reformations in Asia? And I basically say, yes, in some ways it is a hyper modernism, right? It's like hyper modernist. But then in other ways I say, no, it's actually a countering. It's trying to correct the excesses and the unhelpful developments of Buddhist modernism. So I basically, do this both and analysis. That's going to be really important because then it's going to lead to my theorizing of how can we best account for this, like both and. So then essentially I do a similar thing with the racial justice work. So in my chapter on the dukkha of racism, the suffering, right, the unsatisfactoriness of racism, essentially I focus on, I actually don't really use my East Bay material because I'd already published that. I basically take the Insight community of Washington, Sangha as an example. And I also look at the wider Insight teacher training movement. And I basically offer like a history of how one specific Insight community and also the kind of larger kind of authoritative bodies, the senior teachers and the institutions, Spirit Rock and IMS, like what's been going on in those spaces around racial diversity. And actually there's been a lot going on, it's now nearly 3 decades of work. And essentially I do the same, right? I always lead with the history. I try and clarify the history for people, say like, you read this history and see, I want them to read the history and then see what they think and then see if my theoretical offering makes sense. And so at the end of the chapter, I do a kind of similar thing. I say, like, how can we make sense of racial justice work? And I essentially say, look, racial justice work is like, it kind of applies pressure to kind of modern assumptions, right? So racial justice work is, as I say, is very much about identifying cultural, social location, like your identity. You know, I guess one way would be identity politics, to think of it as an identity politic. Although I try and shy away from it because it's got a lot of associations for people. But essentially I say that is, you know, that's a push against this one size fits all, which essentially presents itself as universal, and neutral. But in reality is actually more like, this is like the world as, you know, middle class white people see it. Obviously, I'm making some generalizations here, so I apologize if I'm tweaking anyone. I also say it pushes at individualism, because a lot of racial justice work is very much about, like, we need to develop community. So remember, there was that emphasis on individual practice. That's kind of like pushed against. And another important thing it does is to say, look, white converts often talk about this difference between essential Buddhism, real Buddhism, which they are doing, and cultural Buddhism, which those Asian Americans are doing. And essentially, you know, that's racist because they're set in a kind of hierarchy where, you know, the white Buddhists just appeared on the, you know, the new kids on the block are suddenly like, we're getting this Buddhism right, and you're all doing that old superstitious stuff. So it's deeply painful and offensive to the Asian American heritage community. Remember, they've been the earliest Buddhists in the United States who've been really preserving the Dharma under intense, you know, discrimination, oppression, including the internment camps, you know, that we unfortunately weren't able to get into the history of that. So essentially in racial justice work, they essentially say, look, there is no pure form of Buddhism above culture or history. You know, all forms of Buddhism across Asia, across different, you know, cultural and historical epochs, they're all cultured. That doesn't mean that they're saying Buddhism is just culture. I will say that because I think that it's important to note that for religious practitioners, they rarely think that they're just doing culture or they're just doing history. You know, there is this sense that there is a kind of ultimate truth in their practice, but they're essentially asking us to think a bit more messy, a bit more realistic about how all religious practice is always cut through with like conditioning, historical, cultural, personal. And actually that's a super Buddhist like principle, that all reality is conditioned, right? So it is very congruent in a way with the Buddhist reading of like ultimate nature. So essentially I do this kind of work, the historical work and then the theoretical work, for these 6 different case studies. And then in my last 2 chapters, I kind of try and like theorize a little, you know, I try and make some general statements. And so I basically, in the penultimate chapter, I say, okay, look, you know, there is a continuation of, you know, modernism and convert characteristics, but there's some new movements. And I kind of come up with these terms. They're just my terms. I like the sound of them. One is the critical. I really like alliteration. They all begin with the C. So one of them is what I call the critical turn. Now, the critical turn essentially refers in a way to a humility, essentially, of, you know, practitioners now, you know, 30, 40, you know, 50 years into the communities, kind of saying, well, you know, we're not as great as we thought we were. Like, we've missed stuff here. So if you remember, like, one of the things about the New Buddhism, like, if you see this slide, this book, The New Buddhism, this was written by a sociologist about 22 years ago, I think, but 20 years ago, something like that. And one of the things about the book that struck me was there was this, like, tremendous excitement in these like new white lineages, like we're going to make a Buddhism free from the patriarchy and free from all the problems of culture. And, it's a kind of grandiosity. You could also, many would, I think, appropriately also call it Western ethnocentrism. Again, there's a few different ways to read it, and they probably overlap to a great degree. The mood's really changing here. The mood here is a bit like, well, wait a minute, we've got these, it's great we've got these female teachers, but I'm looking around the room and everyone's white. Something's like, I'm not living in a white city, so what's going on? Obviously, there's a whiteness issue here, right? They're also noticing, that divide, like Asian American heritage communities are like, hello, we've been here all along. Actually, a great article by that title by Funi Su. And they're kind of realizing like, wow, we really push the Asian Americans out of the story of Buddhism in America here. I'm saying this like the white converts realize this, but really this consciousnthis has come about because of the people who've been excluded in these groups have been like, hey, hello, you've like the people who are on the margins, that's often what we, as a dominant culture, you learn about what's missing and wrong in your dominant culture from those who are not assimilated into your dominant culture. I think we all, have a sense of this as queers, as gay men, lesbians, however you identify. I identify as a lesbian or a queer. They're also talking about the problems with individualism, both the focus on individual practice, but also the kind of commodification and the ways in which Buddhist practice is kind of being merging with like American, individualism and kind of conquering the world. And then also neoliberalism, because you've really got the capitalist kind of, machine really revving up, especially with secular mindfulness. So this is actually a super article, one of my favorite like articles in contemporary Buddhism. It's called White Trash Buddhist, and it's essentially a first person account. Brent, the guy's called Brent, I've forgotten his second name, really fantastic writer, hilarious, you laugh your head off as you're reading it. And he basically talks like, what's it like being a working class white, in this case, white Buddhist, in these lineages, because remember, because of the kind of middle class culture, there's an unconsciousness around economics and just, the life conditions of your general working class person. So that's one kind of thing I note. Another turn I note is what I call the contextual turn. So the contextual turn is really like saying, essentially it's saying, look, Buddhist practice doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like these traditions, these practices that we had, they didn't just drop down from the sky. Like they themselves have come out of this historical, political, social context. So you've got all the historical context that people are starting to wake up to. For example, realizing, historically Buddhists didn't all meditate. Like that was like, wow, big news to a lot of Buddhists because they were only ever introduced to modern Buddhism as Buddhism. So it's like they didn't know all of the history. So that's contextual turning. Another big important part of the contextual turn is like, what are the economic contexts? What are the racial contexts of our practice today? And so again, pushing on this universalism of Buddhist modernism. These are really good. This is also a really good article. I don't know if you know Pablo Das, but essentially he wrote this as a response to when President Trump got elected the first time. So many Buddhists, I think, like white liberal Americans were like really shocked, like how could this happen? And some very well-meaning Buddhists, white, straight, middle class ones, wrote these very well-intentioned, well, we should have equanimity and, we should have compassion, just a general response. But Pablo Das was like, excuse me, it's easy for you to say, oh, we should have equanimity and compassion because you're not going to be a targeted population. And so he really talks about like, what does it mean as a gay Buddhist from my own social location to, being in this like world with Trump now. And, what does that bring up for me? And how can I, practice in a way that, pushes against the stream of the, of what he saw as the, the kind of poison of Trump, and doesn't just kind of passively assimilate. So that would be a good, I think you'd all enjoy that article. And then finally, I talk about the collective turn. And the collective turn is really referring to, this movement to interrogating the individualism of Buddhist modernism. And it happens on multiple levels. So one level that happens is you start to see the introduction and the development of like insight dialogues or social meditation. The Buddhist geeks do this thing called social meditation. And essentially what they are they're trying to make meditation more relational. So they're trying to take the skill or the kind of consciousness that you cultivate on your individual cushion, and they're trying to make it a more relational practice. That would be one example of the collective turn, a way of thinking more like communally about practice. Another is, you start hearing a lot about not just dukkha as, the three poisons within the practitioner that we all try and combat, as good Buddhists. But dukkha as like, how do we see dukkha in the world around us? So you get like Buddhists talking about racism, structural racism, as like a kind of, collective form of aversion or ignorance. And corresponding with seeing poisons, the afflictions, the Buddhist afflictions on a collective level, structural level, one starts to see, well, what kind of practices do we need to combat? And so now, and this is, you've probably seen it, especially in relationship to racial justice. Lama Rod Owens, Reverend Angel Kyodo Williams, they really talk about collective liberation as well as individual liberation. It's a kind of soteriological movement towards a collective liberation. And then a great book here, I just wanted to give you some, real easy examples to see, is Larry Yang, absolutely fantastic, dear person, friend, and someone I admire so much in the world. He wrote this great book. What's it called? Awakening Together, and the spiritual practice of inclusivity and community. So you can see here really just in the title of the book, how this is, essentially, saying, look, the kind of more like white individualism, it's really limiting for many Buddhists, and actually not just Buddhists of color, but white Buddhists themselves, So the book's a lot about like how to bring more practices of community to majority white kind of convert lineages. And then finally, I've nearly finished, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. Essentially, having gone through the 6 case studies and then, highlighted the critical, contextual and collective turn, I then basically asked this question. This question is really me speaking to other academics, I'm like speaking to my colleagues who've produced this work on Buddhist modernism. And I'm basically saying to them like, look, the new developments that are happening in these communities, they don't actually fit in a modernist framework. And in fact, not only do they not fit, they're actually pushing against, some of them are explicitly anti-modernist. So then I say like, well, what's the best theories that how can we like theorize better? And then essentially there's a whole chapter in which I just, take different prevailing models of what's happened in what we're seeing in late capitalism. Essentially, there's all these sociological and historical and philosophical models. And I kind of consider the models in relationship to my data. And essentially, what I conclude is this is basically the theoretical contribution of the book, which is probably less interesting to actual practitioners than the ethnographies. So I'm not going to go into it, don't worry, in detail. But I just basically say, look, actually, if we look at the models of the postmodern, post-colonial, remember modern Buddhism is kind of colonial Buddhism as well. And also the secularism is a big thread of modernity. I say these are more helpful models to make sense of what's going on. And then I kind of, get into a bit more kind of detail about that. So hopefully good. I've done quite well on the time. I think better this week. I'm going to stop share and then we can have a good chat together. Okay, I'm not going to respond to any questions in the chat because I got in trouble last week, joke. But I will, hopefully we will get to it eventually.
And I think you should feel free to respond to questions in the chat. It might be, it might be useful to just read the question for people who will be listening to the tape later on.
Sure. Okay, so the question is is it Zerdan? Yeah, sorry, I'm terrible at pronunciation. So Zerdan is here and his question is, I always think of S.N. Gwenka when I think of Vipassana, but I didn't hear you mention this figure and its history. Was that intentional? The main reason I ask is due to his popularity. So I actually do talk about S.N. Gwenka in my book. So American Dharma, the first chapter, it's called Buddhist Modernism from Asia to America. And I have a whole section on Gwenka. Gwenka is certainly hugely relevant to this history. He was an Asian Buddhist modernist. For those of you who don't know, Gwenka was an Indian by nationality, but he lived in Myanmar and he studied with one of the students of one of the leading Burmese modernist monks. And then he was a big teacher, actually. He was a big lineage he was a big he was one of the main teachers of the Insight community. Actually, it's quite interesting with Gwenka because when the Insight community began, they, I think I'd mentioned last week, they had two main lineages, the Myanmar Burmese lineage and the Thai lineage. And they didn't want to just do one lineage, right? They wanted to have it open to multiple lineages, not like all kinds, but like the forest tradition, the Burmese lineage, a couple of differences within the Burmese lineage. And Gwenka's really against that. He's very much like, he was insistent on keeping to his lineage and keeping his lineage kind of pure and untampered with. So they actually decided that's kind of in some ways when Gwenka drops out of the Insight tradition, but of course has his own very flourishing tradition. And there's a great book that came out on Gwenka. It came out last year. I think the guy's called Daniel Stewart. He's an academic, but he's also a long-term student of Gwenka. I think he's been in the community for like 2 or 3 decades. So he has tremendous depth. So I'd really recommend, for those of you who are interested, pick up the Gwenka book. One thing I will say is that Daniel actually complicates the standard reading of Gwenka as, really rational and modernist. And he kind of brings in more like what we might consider traditionalist aspects. And that's actually something what's happening now, that scholars are getting a more complex picture of Buddhist modernism and realizing it itself was super messy and maybe also postmodern in a way. So yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I appreciate you.
And we have a question here in the center.
Yeah, great. Jeff, okay, I can see you. Yeah.
I keep thinking while you're talking about the Dalai Lama and Tibetan Buddhism and my own interest in going to the roots of Buddhism and not just Vipassana, but in graduate school studying with a former secretary of the Dalai Lama. We studied the Abhidhamma for a year, and so the Dalai Lama was around a lot then, and he got his Nobel Peace Prize during that period. And he seemed to be a real proponent of this secular Buddhism. He'd say things like, my religion is kindness, and if science proves Buddhism wrong, then Buddhism has to change. And so he sort of unreified Buddhism, I thought. So how do you hold him in this whole matter?
Well, I really appreciate you bringing him up. So, the Dalai Lama is, he's really considered, to kind of wear multiple hats. Mm-hmm. So certainly, especially in his kind of public facing work with, Western, kind of international audiences, he's also been a very strong advocate and driver of Buddhist modernism. He's, he was part of there's this whole series, I'm sure you're familiar with, the Mind and Life series, which is, this real engagement between Tibetan Buddhists and, the leading Western neuroscientists. And the Dalai Lama has been super enthusiastic about that. So certainly as scholars, we consider him a Buddhist modernist. On the other hand, the Dalai Lama, often when he's speaking to, the Tibetan diaspora, the teachings that he gives to the Tibetan diaspora are, more traditional, so it's not like he's always, he teaches Buddhist modernism, and he is, impeccable in, kind of holding the lineage, the Gelugpa lineage that he, is the head of. And so, he's both a Buddhist, essentially, he's considered a manifestation, an incarnation of Chenrezig, who's, just skillful means, he's both a Buddhist traditionalist and he's both a Buddhist modernist. He kind of, he articulates a dialogue and the discourse that he considers, helpful in that particular context. What's kind of interesting, though, about the Dalai Lama is he is very much a fan of science, as you might know himself. In his biography, he talks about he loves taking things apart, and he's very fascinated by engineering and science and stuff. And he has said that, like, if something is found not to be scientific, we should drop it. But no one's proven reincarnation is scientific. And certainly the Dalai Lama has not, dropped reincarnation. So it's, you want to hold it lightly when he says, if it's not scientific, we'll drop it. What he does actually, which is really smart, is to him and, other Tibetans, they kind of, they kind of accept science, but they also kind of press on science. They basically point to, they say that you don't want to, like, science in a way isn't like big enough to contain the richnesses of Tibetan Buddhism. Like, they don't just, it's a dialogue, they're not just like, hey, we're going to get really small and like we're not going to just become assimilated to science. Like, they advocate for science to kind of push itself beyond its kind of, normative boundaries. So I think there's a little bit of subversion happening as well in those dialogues in the Mind and Life. Like, in some ways, it's like, it just kind of reminds me of the genius of Asian Buddhist modernists, where they're kind of like, I'll play your game and I'll beat you at your game, I'll take on your modernist discourse and I'll kind of, show you, like, I'll push you beyond, like, I'll show you how we're even more scientific than you and Christianity. So there's, I think, multiple things happening with the Dalai Lama, and scholars, tend to highlight that. Also, even with the, even like with the Tibetan literature, some of the Tibetan literature, as the Mahayana Suttas and the Vajrayana texts, they're not historically traceable to the historic Buddha, but the tradition kind of articulates them as, their teachings given by other Buddhas, the multiple Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Now, all of those texts are still really revered and, considered sacred in Tibet. But historically, like, as historians, we can't say, oh, no, they did come from the original Buddha. So that's not scientific either. So again, you always have to hold it a bit lightly, I think, his like adoption of modernist rhetoric. But he's definitely a modernizer for sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
Gary has his hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much, Anne. This is very helpful. I began my Buddhist practice 9 years ago, being influenced by the writings of Chogyam Trungpa and Pema Chodron, and I wonder if you could tell us where you would place the Shambhala school in the history, in the lineage.
Okay, well, Shambhala, I'm kind of smiling awkwardly because Shambhala, of course, has had generational abuses, sexual abuses, and I'm working on this book now on sexual violence in Buddhism. So I've really been engaging with Shambhala from that lens, which is, quite disturbing in all honesty. Trungpa, a bit, similar to is a modernist, definitely. Trungpa is a modernist. I mean, in many ways, the genius modernist, not just he was a modernist for the counterculture. He had one of the things that he did super well was really, really had his finger on the pulse of not just modernism, but like the counterculture, the version of the modernism that comes through the counterculture. So in that sense, we definitely think in academia of Trungpa as a modernist. He also he liked to kind of, he's in some ways, he's quite postmodern because he also liked to sometimes draw on like a kind of ahistoric, idealized view of Tibetan history and kind of sometimes bring that into the Shambhala Center. So, we heard these stories of, the Sangha would be engaged in like wild parties for like 6 months and we'd be all partying and there'd be a lot of, sex and alcohol. And then he would like install like the Kusang, the military police and have us all, really take on and learn the more kind of traditional kind of rituals. So he was a bit of a trickster. I think he really played with like, tradition and modernity. But often I think the way that he played with tradition in a way was it wasn't really a traditional tradition or way, if you know what I mean. It was more like, it seems more strategic. I think I also remember interviewing someone who said that when a couple of other lamas came to visit, I can't remember who they were, but they were big teachers in the Kagyu tradition. And that in preparation for their visit, the community was really kind of trained in, this is the traditional way to receive Tibetan teachers. So certainly he had the training himself to call on when he needed to, when that was appropriate. But generally, no, Shambhala is definitely a Buddhist modernist lineage, yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Well, thank you, Anne. It looks like we're out of time.
Great. Well, let me ask you, just as a general group check-in, was the pace of the material okay for everyone? Did you stay with me more or less?
Yeah, summer school, great.
Great. Well, I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope that, I hope that the academic work is some use to you as practitioners.
Thank you very much. We're going to have announcements, and then we'll gather for our dedication of merit. And would you like to do the dedication of merit today? Or
I know, but I don't want to do it, but I'd love to stay with you, if that's okay.
Okay.
Stay and do it.
So do we have any announcements today? We have a host. Hi, Mark.
Hi. I am the host today, and please stay and enjoy the company of the Sangha, and there are refreshments and hot water for tea. Just go ahead and leave your dishes in the sink, not put them in the dishwasher, they'll be fine. And I'll also go around with a Dana bowl to accept contributions to cover expenses. Dana, giving from a place of gratitude. We suggest $10 to $20 to help meet the expenses, honorarium for our Dharma speakers, rent, monthly dinners, quarterly newsletters. In addition, there's a I don't think anyone's new here, but there's a sign-up sheet called the Credenza if you'd like to sign up and get our newsletters. And some of us go for lunch at 12:30. You can stick around for that. I wish all of you on the screen were here, and you can join us, but here. Thank you.
And we have a retreat coming up.
We do, yes, which has been changed to September 10th. So if you were planning on going 30th of July, change your calendar and please come on the 10th of September with Renee Rivera.
For an all-day retreat.
Yeah, 10 to 3.
Here.
Here, in person, yes.
No.
And on Zoom, yes.
Thank you, Stephen, for your question. People who would like to contribute to Dana, to the Gay Buddhist, can go to gaybuddhist.org, and there's a donate button. We can accept your donation that way, and there's also a mailing address if you would prefer to send a check. Jack.
I just have a practical announcement. For people who come to GBF in person, next week is the San Francisco Marathon, which cuts the city off from itself. And it's hard to get around if you're driving, you can take 3 ways to circle around from one side of the city to another. Yeah. But just be aware of that.
Thank you.
I just want to point out that the question, as part of Stephen's question, was how do we also give Dana to Anne? Anne, is there a way people can contact you also?
Actually, Cass already sent me some money and a beautiful card. Thank you. My wife loves that card, by the way. It was really beautiful. we were reveling in it.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Do you have a website, Anne?
Oh, I've just got a faculty page. I've been paid. Sorry, it sounds really transactional. Right. But thank you for asking.
Next week, our speaker will be Eugene Cash. Again, you could go to gaybuddhist.org and get more information about Eugene. So let's gather for our dedication of merit. By the power and truth of this practice, may all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free from sorrow and the causes of sorrow. May all never be separated from the sacred happiness which is without sorrow, and may all live in equanimity without too much attachment or too much aversion, believing in the equality of all that lives. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.